Pistols. They're proven firearms, but they're usually not deployed as primary weapons. There are a few reasons for this, namely, their lack of ballistic capability and ammo capacity. But that hasn't stopped people from adapting handguns into a primary role. And of course, that's carried over to games, even more so than real life. So the question is, why are pistol primaries a viable choice in so many games? The idea of a pistol primary has been around for a long time. However, the reasons individuals and organizations have wanted a pistol primary has changed throughout history. During the advent of semi-automatic pistols, many attempted to adopt them as primary weapons. One of the most notable examples was the Mauser C96. The German-designed handgun first saw significant use with military officers across Europe, including a young Winston Churchill. In his memoirs, Churchill described how he brought the C96 into battle. Using the pistol on horseback, he noted that the handgun proved very effective against enemy swordsmen. Despite being in very close quarters, the Mauser prevailed against the swords. In fact, the Mauser's small size was likely a benefit in such close and fierce combat. Stories like these were not unique, and word of the Mauser's combat prowess led to its increase in popularity. Soon, many countries were adopting the handgun, whether officially through imports or unofficially via unlicensed production. But Churchill's accounts aren't significant just because they prove the Mauser's success in combat. His story is also important because it's one of the first documented cases of a handgun being used as a primary weapon. So why did Churchill, along with many other users, choose the Mauser C96 as a primary weapon? The Mauser C96 is much quicker to reload than a revolver, and holds 10 rounds, much higher capacity than the revolvers popular at that time, and its small size made the handgun much easier to handle than long rifles. But it's an adaptable weapon as well. Some Mausers came with an optional wooden stock that makes the weapon much easier to shoot. These attributes were very forward-thinking for the times, and they all pointed to the C96 becoming a primary weapon. But while the Mauser was an instant hit, its ubiquity would prove to be short-lived. Other, more advanced handguns would soon find their way into the hands of soldiers. While these handguns were more modern than the Mauser, few were used as primary weapons. Handguns are great for close quarters because of their relatively small size, but their small stature, combined with the lack of a stock, makes them more difficult to shoot than other firearm types. Instead of continuing to adapt the handgun as a primary weapon for close distances, an idea emerged. Why not create a new weapon designed to fire a pistol round that was easier to shoot? A larger magazine, stock, and full auto setting later, the submachine gun was born. The submachine gun was easier to shoot thanks to its stock, held more ammunition than a handgun, and had a full auto setting, allowing a user to fire a controlled burst into a target. It was a perfect weapon for close quarters combat, and mostly ended the need for handguns in a primary weapon role. But while submachine guns became the apex predators of close quarters, the desire for a handgun never went away. After World War II, Germany was a country divided into two: the Communist East and the Democratic West. In the West, there was a fear of a potential invasion by the Soviet Union. One idea to repel an attack was to arm the civilian populace. To this end, the German company Heckler & Koch designed the VP-70 pistol, which began production in 1970. It was intended to be a cheap and easy to manufacture firearm that could be easily distributed to the population. In fact, its name, Volkspistol, translates to the people's pistol. Unfortunately, this is a concept modern-day H&K seems to have abandoned entirely. The gun introduced many features that are commonplace today in modern handguns: a polymer frame, striker-fired trigger, and 18-round magazine. This made for a handgun that was light and held significantly more rounds than most popular handguns at the time. An optional stock also gave the military version of the handgun a 3-round burst. If these features sound similar to the Mauser C96, it's likely that this is no coincidence. Some former employees of Mauser went on to work at H&K, so it's plausible to believe some of those individuals brought their ideas from the C96 to the VP70. This also means that the intention behind the VP70 may have been similar to the Mausers. While there are no records of the philosophy behind the gun other than its role in stopping a Soviet invasion, it is plausible that the VP70 was intended to be a primary weapon. But on the other hand, a pistol used by an insurgent populace to fight against Soviet soldiers seems optimistic at best. In reality, the VP70 was more likely intended to be used to kill a soldier to steal his weapon, or assassinate high-ranking officials. Despite all its features, the VP70 never saw widespread use. Perhaps it was the ridiculously heavy trigger, rudimentary sights, or most importantly, simply being lackluster when a submachine gun could do everything the VP70 does, but better. Nevertheless, the VP70 represents another footnote in history where a handgun was seemingly designed for a primary role. H&K would try their hand at designing a pistol primary again in 1991, though this time, the request for the handgun would come from a foreign country. In the year 1989, the United States Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, began an attempt to standardize all of their small arms. As special operations are disproportionately exposed to close-quarters combat, the likelihood of them using a handgun as a primary weapon is much higher than the average soldier. In terms of size, handguns are much easier to maneuver in close quarters compared to a rifle, or even a submachine gun. So, the offensive handgun weapon system competition began. Or in other words, the search for a new handgun that could be used as a primary weapon. Compared to other pistols before it, SOCOM immediately demanded features that would set this handgun apart from others that were typically used as backup weapons. Firstly, the handgun was to be chambered in 45 ACP, and needed to handle higher pressure variants of the round.
45, huh?
Handgun rounds have always been inferior to rifle rounds when it comes to ballistic capability, so SOCOM needed a more powerful handgun round to bridge the gap between the two. It also needed to be able to accommodate both a suppressor and laser aiming module, and the handgun needed to be exceptionally reliable. H&K exceeded expectations with their submission to the competition. The Mark 23 is an incredibly reliable handgun. It averaged over 6,000 rounds fired before a failure, with some firing over 15,000 rounds before a single failure, and the handgun maintained its accuracy throughout the various torture tests it was subjected to. It handled suppressor use without any problems, and was able to mount a laser aiming module without issue. It was no surprise then that SOCOM adopted the Mark 23 Mod 0 as its first offensive handgun, or in other words, a pistol primary. It certainly seemed capable. A reliable handgun that could be suppressed, had lasers for night vision use, and could fire higher pressure 45 ACP loads. But how often was the Mark 23 actually used? Accounts vary. Some claim they weren't used at all. Others state the Mark 23 came in handy in a variety of scenarios, from being used to quietly take out an adversary on a recon mission, or clearing out rooms in a cramped ship. Allegedly, one of the heaviest users of the Mark 23 was the Navy's SEAL Delivery Vehicle teams. The SEAL Delivery Vehicle, or SDV, is a very small and light submersible that accommodates 4 SEALs. Typically, it's used to carry out covert missions, with the SEALs using the SDV to infiltrate an area and carry out reconnaissance. On these missions, operators prefer to travel light, so rather than bringing a rifle, many of these SEALs opted to bring the Mark 23 as their primary weapon. While it's a huge handgun, it's still nowhere near the size of any rifle. Others still made use of it in Afghanistan, though there aren't many details available. The Mark 23 is perhaps the most notable and successful example of a pistol primary, but even though it's been proven in combat, it was never used as much compared to rifles and submachine guns. It's safe to say then, that handguns aren't usually chosen as a primary weapon. Even with professionals who do, handguns are chosen because of their size, not because of their effectiveness compared to larger firearms. Simply put, handguns are not as ballistically effective as rifles, and are harder to shoot than weapons with stocks. Well, a new innovation has become popular in recent years to try and address one of these problems. Pistol conversion kits are kits that can convert a basic handgun into a firearm with features like an optic mount, extra magazine, and stock. These kits make firing a handgun much easier, and also means a user will be able to shoot a converted handgun out to further distances thanks to the stock. As we've seen, stocks on a handgun are not a new concept, but unlike the stocks of the old, many of these new stocks are collapsible. This means that these converted pistols can provide the shooter with a stock for better control, while still collapsing into a compact package that's still easy to carry around. The idea of a pistol conversion kit is not a new one. They've been around for more than 10 years, so they've had time to evolve from a range toy novelty to a practical firearm. They've advanced to the point where some kits are being sold as fully functional firearms, like the Flux Raider. Rather than having to sacrifice a handgun to install into a kit, the Flux Raider is a pre-assembled firearm that uses the fire control group from a SIG P320. It also comes with an optic mount, rail space for lights and lasers, and a forward magazine well that lets you store an extra mag on the gun. It works quite well from an ergonomic standpoint, and is much easier to shoot than a standard P320. In fact, the Flux Raider works so well that it's being evaluated by the 19th Special Forces Group as a potential addition to their arsenal. There are also rumors that the Flux Raider may be undergoing testing by dev crew as a potential replacement for the MP7, though this has not been officially confirmed. So, what does this sound like? Well, once again, it appears SOCOM is looking to acquire a handgun as a primary weapon. Time will tell whether or not the Flux Raider becomes a weapon used by special operations, but the interest in a handgun primary has evidently remained. But despite more than a century of advancement, handguns are not usually a first choice as a primary weapon. Other than the lack of a stock, there's two factors that contribute to handguns not being chosen as primary weapons: ammo capacity and ballistic capability. While 10 rounds may have been impressive in 1896, even 18-round handgun magazines today pale in comparison to the standard 30 most rifles hold. As past experiences have demonstrated, the accuracy of an individual degrades significantly in a gunfight, so more rounds are better. Regarding ballistic capability, handgun rounds are generally not as effective as rifle rounds. They don't travel as far, and don't cause as much damage compared to a rifle round. Even in close quarters, there's a significant difference between a rifle and a pistol round. There are many accounts of assailants taking 8 or more handgun rounds before they were neutralized. This difference is only made more evident when body armor is involved. Compared to rifle rounds, pistol rounds are generally not as good at penetrating armor. Most notably, during the 1997 North Hollywood shootout, police revolvers were unable to penetrate homemade body armor that the criminals were wearing. So overall, while there have been attempts to make the handgun a primary weapon, it isn't something that's seen much in the real world. But the question remains, if handgun primaries are so uncommon in real life, why are they so popular in video games? Well, the first and most important factor is that it's cool to see your hero take on bad guys with nothing but a handgun. Everyone likes cheering for an underdog, but the other reason has to do with how video games work. Many shooters reduce ballistics to damage numbers. Bigger bullets have higher damage numbers, while smaller bullets have lower numbers. So rather than handguns being completely ineffective against certain targets or at certain ranges, they simply deal less damage. But aside from that, there's many attributes of handguns that are portrayed differently in video games than in real life. There's also recoil. Bigger bullets have higher recoil numbers, while smaller bullets have lower numbers. Some games simply ignore the fact that even a lower caliber handgun can have more felt recoil than a rifle. In real life, extended mags aren't typically used in handguns for defensive purposes. This is due to a combination of size and weight considerations, as well as the reliability of some of these mags. But in video games, these attributes aren't usually a factor, so there isn't much of a downside to using an extended mag in a handgun. Handguns are also much lighter than other firearms. Many games represent this by giving players with handguns more movement speed. And finally, One interesting quirk that many handguns in video games have is that their reload speed is much faster than that of most other firearms. So, when you have a weapon that you can move around quickly with, has the same ammo capacity or more than a rifle's, and has low recoil, that weapon suddenly becomes much more attractive as a primary. And with pistol rounds simply being a lower damage number than rifle rounds, the simple solution is to shoot more. Handguns are not the ideal primary weapon, but that hasn't stopped many individuals from adopting them. Historically, there were situations where handguns were more effective compared to longer options. But in modern day, they're carried mostly due to their smaller size. But in some games, a lot of their downsides are nullified or don't exist at all. A handgun with a larger mag, little recoil, and minimal damage penalty at range can be quite effective. In some cases, more so than larger firearms. In recent years, there have been many innovations that have increased the effectiveness of handguns. Only time will tell whether these upgraded pistols will find a place as a primary weapon of choice. But one thing's for sure, as long as there are shooters being made, pistols will continue to have a starring role as the main weapon.